Mm.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's 4 p.m. here in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I'm going to welcome you to today's talk, which is called Environmental Humanities at Scale, Emotions, Islands, Crises. I'm Charlotte Rogers. My pronouns are she and her. Welcome virtually to my office here at the University of Virginia, which is located on unceded Monacan lands and was built by enslaved laborers. Facts that reveal two of the cultural and environmental catastrophes that continue to reverberate in our university community and beyond. So our conversation today is part of Environmental Humanities at UVA, and it's sponsored by the Page Barber Fund. The aim of our event is to discuss the affective dimensions of the overlapping crises occurring on islands today, as well as their historical depth. So often in academia, when the matter of scale arises, the focus remains on scaling things up. Today, I propose that we scale things down, considering the small batch local experiences of different bodies, which feel things differently, forming an emotional, affective patchwork that, taken together, have a global import. I also know that at this point, we are tired of Zoom, but today's talk reminds us of its virtues, right? Some of our speakers are coming to us today from Australia, from Puerto Rico, and also from France, meaning that for some of them it is 6 a.m. on Tuesday, while for others it is 11 p.m. on Monday. So I just want to thank each of them for being here with us today. Those panelists are Roque Raquel Salas Rivera, Malcolm Ferdinand, and Blanche Verily. Rather than using up our time to list the major accolades of each speaker, and they have a lot of them, instead I'm going to put their bios in the chat, enabling you to read about them also while you listen. So first we're going to hear from Roque Raquel Salas Rivera, then from Malcolm Ferdinand, and then from Blanche Verily. Each of them will speak to us for about 8 to 10 minutes about their work involving emotions, islands, and crises. And then I'll open up the floor for questions. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A app in the bottom of the Zoom screen. And I look forward to hearing answers to those in the second half of our webinar. So thank you very much, Roque. We're listening to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the panelists. I believe that part of why I was invited was this book, While They Sleep Under the Bed Is Another Country, which, depending on whether you think of it in terms of when it was written or when it was published, it's my fourth or fifth book. And I figured I'd start talking a little bit about its creation, where it came from, and then perhaps move into more recent work and read some poetry, because at the end of the day, I'm more a poet than a scholar or anything else. So this book, in a way, is a continuation of my previous book, Lo Terciario, which was about the Puerto Rican debt crisis and the Promesa Law. And ends on Hurricane Maria's impact, in particular, sort of a poem that engages with my grandmother and sort of imagining having contact with her. She got electricity back in December of 2017. So, some months after the hurricane, she lives out in Mayagüez. And that book, was already a very difficult book to write because of the impact of the Promesa Law on my life, on the lives of everyone I knew, and sort of a heartbreaking text. And then I wrote it, up until the last poem before Maria had hit. Once Maria hit, I was involved in two major fundraising campaigns which I sort of was key in organizing. One was Puerto Rico Mi Corazón, which was a series of broadsides. And it was challenging because there were a lot of fundraisers happening for Puerto Rican poets, but many of them did not feature Puerto Rican poets. And that was kind of striking to me, that it would be sort of like a notion of aid that was very much about sort of charity, right? Or this idea of, oh, these poor people. But, the ways in which we were narrated often ended up being very much about an imagined desire for belonging to the United States. So, usually within the framework of US political parties, Democrats, Republicans, a vilification of Trump, which is very understandable because it's very easy to vilify, but little to no acknowledgement of the conditions that had been established by the Democratic Party. That Promesa was passed under Obama, for example, right? That kind of set the foundations for what was going to come, which was the impact of Maria, which there are plenty of disaster study scholars that can go into all the details of why, right, that is a structural, crisis that occurred, and not just an ecological in the strict sense, or the imaginary of nature as this destructive force, right? That excludes humans, or those deemed humans. I'm already thinking of Malcolm and what he might come in to say later. But I was organizing that fundraiser. I was also helping to bring about 5 trans people to Philadelphia from Puerto Rico so they could either permanently or temporarily relocate. So a lot of the work I was doing day to day involved not just helping people navigate a system that was English only and not designed for them, under the premise that they had citizenship, when in fact they've often found themselves in a position of being treated as immigrants, because people in the United States had no idea what Puerto Rico was or its relationship to the United States. And with varying degrees of precarity, navigating that system as an intermediary in many ways, as a translator, while also, not having contact with my own family. And I was in Philadelphia without really anyone else. I'd gone to graduate school in Philadelphia, but I didn't have family in Philadelphia. The closest family I had was Chicago and maybe New York. So I was basically sort of cut off. And what ended up happening was that I had a great deal of responsibility, like many people after Maria in the diaspora, especially. I took on a lot of responsibility, and then responded to that by organizing without having a lot of space for my own emotions and my own reactions to what was happening, trying to create spaces where people could sort of relax or kind of find community after being displaced and come together, often meant being in the position of the listener and not the speaker. And my way of processing that was writing While They Sleep Under the Bed Is Another Country, which is actually a verse from the Terciario, a sort of imagined colonial subject, growing up as a young boy, a member, later to become a member of the Fiscal Control Board, sort of imagining a past for this member of this oligarchical board who, sort of had a very normal middle-class white life in the United States, and imagines Puerto Rico in many ways as a sort of monster, like of the unconscious beneath his bed, threatening in some ways his life, his normalcy. And the text, I rarely read from it. I'm not going to read from it today. I didn't even really read from it when it launched. My poor editor was subjected to organizing about 6 readings for me and having me read from the text, and almost none of them. I'm sorry, Samson, if you're hearing this, but it's very difficult for me to read from it. The book launch, I did read from the larger book launch at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. And what I did was that we turned off all the lights. I had a recording a friend had created during Maria of a candle, just a candle sort of moving, and the sound of the hurricane. And I read with a flashlight, and I gave a series of instructions before reading. You can find the recording online. People couldn't drink water or speak to each other or share. And, it was in a way cathartic, possibly re-traumatizing. The responses of it have been varied. For some it's cathartic, for some they can't finish it. So I think that's about enough in terms of the book. How much time do I have? Do I have enough time to read?
Yes, please. We would love to hear you read. Thanks.
I will be reading from a trans epic called Algarabía, which I have been writing now for about a year and a half. And in this particular segment, the principal character and narrator, Snacks, is traveling through a Walgreens. There are more Walgreens in Puerto Rico per square foot than anywhere else in the United States, or I believe elsewhere. And he travels through this Walgreen in order to reach the center of the Walgreen, this labyrinth. In the center, he's going to acquire his testosterone for his hormone replacement therapy. Los desastres son, en fin, sobrenaturales. Su naturaleza es excesiva. Tienen demasiado viento, demasiado frío. Por eso tiemblan los temblores. Demasiado calor, tanto que como un fuego forestal sudan lobos, conejos, casas. Su caos es su naturaleza. Su error es pasarse, es hablar muy duro, biblioteca monzónica, comer muy rápido, tornados de maíz, tocando base con la amistad, pero a toda boca. Son desastres sobre naturaleza, como el pavochón o una parrilla chinchorro donde se explaya un batallón de carne. Son tan naturales que expulsan el artificio, rechazan las construcciones, se llevan todo lo humanamente inventado por nosotros humanamente. Tan naturales como los médicos que me explican que yo era mujer. Mujer nací, mujer seré, mujer a lo largo de las cordilleras, a lo ancho de los campos altos. Tan, pero tan extraordinariamente naturales. Salas estériles de un hospital donde nos almacenaron cuando llegó la naturaleza a desahuciarnos, rata fría, el alga de una marea negra, la esperma de Poseidón, o de alguna fábrica que en vez de retirarse siguió trabajando de cajero a los 90. De eso se tratan, sobre el estado de ser naturales, sobre los seres naturaleza primero, su lealtad es al desastre. Confiesan tantos pecados que se forma una fila confesionaria y comienzan feligreses borrachos que usan el callejón porque alguien se confiesa en el único baño de la barra. Arrasan, limpian, no dejan nada sobre el plato, nada, se llevan todo en el divorcio contra los humanos. ¿Cómo no iban a ser una segunda y tercera vez un dios del cráneo de otro dios, ya no de la naturaleza del parto, sino a partir de la sobrenaturaleza del desastre? En el centro del laberinto, en el ojo del huracán, está la farmacia en el corazón de un Walgreens donde me venden por primera vez un frasquito del tamaño de un dedal. Otra forma de sobrenaturaleza, de exceso, es esta hormona que mi cuerpo ya tenía, pero que ahora acrecentó hasta inundarme. Una tormenta que encendió el motor de quien nunca se escapó del todo, que me esperó al otro lado del silencio, con la boca abierta, y un grito, 5 gritos, 100,000 gritos sumados en una algarabía. Disasters are in short supernatural. Their nature is excessive. They are too windy, too cold, that's why tremors tremble. Too hot, so much so that like a forest fire, wolves, rabbits, houses sweat. Their chaos is their nature. Your mistake is going too far, talking too loud, monsoon library, eating too fast, corn tornadoes, touching base with friendship, but not holding back a mouthful. They are disasters upon disasters, nature on top of nature, supernature, pavochon or a chinchorro grill where a batallon of meat stretches out. They are so natural that they expel artifice, reject constructions, sweep away everything humanly invented for us humanely. As natural as the doctors who carefully explained that I was a woman. Woman was I born, woman will I be. Woman across mountain ranges, across cemeteries. So, I mean, so extraordinarily natural. Sterile rooms in a hospital where we were stored when nature arrived to evict us. Cold lactoderm, not a seaweed of a black tide, Poseidon sperm or from some factory that instead of retiring continued working as a cashier at 90. That's what they're about, the state of being natural above being's nature first. Their allegiance is to disaster. They confess so many sins that a confessional line grows and the faithful confess until drunks are using the alley because someone is confessing in the bar's only bathroom. They destroy, they sweep clean, they leave an empty plate, they take everything in the divorce against humans. How would he not be born a second and third time, a god from the skull of another god, no longer from the nature of childbirth, but rather from the supernature of disaster? In the center of the labyrinth, in the eye of the hurricane sits the pharmacy, in the heart of a Walgreen, where for the first time they will sell me a vial the size of a thimble. Another form of supernature, of excess. Is this hormone that my body already contained, but had now increased into a flood, a storm, starting the engine of the one who never left, waiting for me on the other side of silence, with his jaw open, and a scream, 5 screams, 100,000 screams condensed as Algarabia. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Roque. I'm going to take that in for a moment. And now I'd like to open the floor for Malcolm Ferdinand to speak with us, and I'll be putting his biography in the chat also. Thank you. Malcolm.
Yep, start. So thank you very much to you, Charlotte, and to Blanche and Roque for convening this panel. It's a pleasure to get to know a bit more of your work. And I had the chance before to go spend some time in Puerto Rico and also in places in Australia as well, long time ago. So I wasn't sure how to start. So I'll guess I shared with Charlotte and over the introduction of a book that was published I think 2 years ago. Well, a year ago in English, but first in French 4 years ago. And it's this book. I'll read it to say it's this book, Decolonial Ecology: Thinking from the Caribbean World. And it's very strange because when I look at this book now, 4 years ago, or 4 years removed from, when I finished the book, I was, so I'm a scholar, and I was thinking, oh, that's it, I've accomplished something, blah, 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 blah. And now I look at it and it's like, okay, well, this is just a starting point. There's just so much more to do. But a lot of the themes that Roque talked about, and to some extent maybe Blanche will also mention, are contained in that book, which was really trying to provide a different understanding of ecological issues generally, climate change at some point. So the reason for that book was in my education. Every time, and both, let's say, university education, but also political education in activist groups. So I lived in Martinique. I'm from Martinique. I grew up there, Caribbean island, French colonized island. Then I spent some time in Europe, also a bit in Australia and in Africa. And in all of these scenes, every time I was mentioning something to do with ecology, to two things would happen. First, the room that I would be in would suddenly become whiter, or wherever I would be, less diverse. But then the concept and the themes that would be talked about would not really relate to what I came to know about the Caribbean. And there was a kind of a disconnect that I term the double fracture of modernity, where if you engage with that environmental destruction, the plunder of the ecosystem of the earth, then somehow you would be tempted to put under the rug the colonial history and slavery history of most of the northern countries, but also some of the southern countries, including Australia, as Blanche know very well. And on the other hand, when I was trying to dig deep, I mean, I could find some intuitions and some mentions, but most of the anti-racist or decolonial groups that I would engage with will not necessarily think that ecological issues would be directed for or would speak for them, for their reality, for what they were striving for. And the whole point, and that's what I termed the double fracture. And the whole point of my book was taking this fracture as a starting point and trying to overcome it, trying to go beyond it and show how actually most of the racialized people on Earth are the ones that would suffer most from different sorts of ecological issues, including climate change, but not only. Whether it's droughts, whether it's chemicals. And I know Puerto Rico like combines almost everything. Martinique to some extent as well, but it's different extent. And it's so, listening to you, Jorge, is like it's so wrong on so many levels that you suffer such a extreme climate event, which Martinique is used to as well, maybe not to the extent to what Maria was in 2017. And then, but there's been such a the vulnerability is a built thing. It's something that is socially constructed, and then once it happens, you are left to hope for help from the former colonizer and so on. So it's a very difficult situation. And so the term, one of the key concepts at the heart of the book, decolonial ecology. Although I use that concept, I don't claim to be the owner of that concept. I don't claim to be the inventor of that concept. It's a way to refer to different practices and policies and ideas that have been existing, for 100 years. Looking at the way indigenous people before Columbus came used to relate to the lands, looking at what some of the Maroons communities in the Americas, some of the whole host of different indigenous and Aboriginal groups around the world. And my goal was at least twofold. First, pointing to the white environmentalists there that they are missing something, that is no longer possible, is no longer tenable, to pretend with their hands on their hearts, oh yeah, we're going to save humanity, trying to reproduce the white man burden issue with the legitimacy of ecological challenges. And at the same time, trying to invite more activist anti-racist groups, even groups that are nowadays in France fighting for against police brutality, recognizing that there is also they are they have much to gain in being able to engage with some of these issues and producing their own conceptualizations of the issues and solutions. And since then, so that's one of the advantage of being 4 years removed. My book has received both positive reviews in terms of the concept has taken roots a little bit in France, a little bit in Martinique as well. You have activists that are on the streets claiming, oh, we want decolonial ecology. but you also have a pushback. You have far right groups that have written op-eds. You have army generals. That's a funny thing in France. Army generals, but are retired in a state where if there is a major war, they can still be called back to serve. They wrote an op-ed calling the president to act against decolonial scholars like myself, and saying if the president does not act, they're gonna act. So this is army people, right? You have so it's part of the struggle. It's an interesting because basically it's just ideas, but people feel threatened when the former colonized, former enslaved suddenly decides to speak, and that's what I'm trying to do. But it's very easy to still be seen as an exotic piece, So I'm invited to talk with members of ecological parties, and that was the case today, this morning, for me. And again, I was the only Black man in the room, and I asked them, okay, why is that? It's a long process. I've also co-founded an NGO since the book that tries to foster and channel and create a space for people that are racialized or from the non-sovereign territories like Puerto Rico is, but the equivalent of France, that want to engage in ecological issues, be aware of what are the latest news politically, scientifically, and what can we do. And we provide free seminars every month. That's some of the things I've been trying to do. I think my time is up, but I'll be happy to continue once the Q&A starts. Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Malcolm. And if you could put the name of your NGO in the chat, we'll make sure to make that more visible for our audience. So thank you. That was great. Wow. So now we're going to turn to our third speaker, Branch Verily, and I'll be putting her bio in the chat also. So go ahead, Blanche. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a huge privilege to be involved with this panel, and tough act to follow after Roque and Malcolm, but we'll see how I go. So I'm calling from Australia, and specifically I'm in Sydney, which is on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Australia is evidently a settler colony, and settled on the lands of over 300 independent First Nations. And so because the premise of today's talk is with a focus on islands, it's had me thinking about Australia as an island. But it's only through colonization that we have come to think of Australia as an island, because I think we're the world's biggest island. And so thinking about environmental humanities at scale as well as islands, I thought would be an interesting way to think through emotions about ecological crisis in Australia. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do. So Australia as a nation state also includes lots of smaller islands, such as Zenadkes, now known as the Torres Strait Islands, and Lutruwita, now known as Tasmania. But most Australians we don't often think of ourselves as inhabiting an island, or at least not consciously that often. It evidently influences a lot of our life, particularly around immigration policy, and other kinds of border security like biosecurity. You can't bring any kinds of living plant or animal material in. We have pretty tough biosecurity rules. But typically we don't think about the fact that we live on an island. But nevertheless, about 85% of the Australian population live near the coast, and that's especially so for the settler population. And so with most of Australia experiencing quite hot weather at some point in the year, going to the beach has become a really, like popular cultural pastime experienced by the vast majority of Australians. That's not to say it's not limited by various forms of access to the beach. But that's become quite an iconic part of our national identity and one of the reasons that people love summer. So idolizing the coast and summer are entwined in what it's come to mean to be Australian. And so I thought what I would provide is some reflections on how Australia's relationship with summer is changing because of climate crisis, and particularly how that plays out along the coast. So this is, I guess, taking a bit of a different lens to what we've heard so far, which is a kind of studying up approach, looking at, mostly white Australians' experiences, and I guess like studying colonial cultures around the environment and the emotions that generates. I guess I'm interested in, well, part of the reason I do this work is, as Malcolm's pointed out, as an environmentalist, I end up in really white privileged circles a lot of the time. And so I guess I like to think that working with those communities to work through how can we decolonize our approaches to environmental issues and, the world more broadly, that's something that I hope that I can contribute to as someone who operates in those spaces. So I'm just going to share some slides, and apologies in advance for, I know you said at the start, Charlotte, around getting tired of disaster studies and how traumatic they can be. So apologies that this probably won't address that, but maybe we can reflect on, I guess, the possible hopeful potential coming out of it. So this talk is mostly about what we've come to call the Black Summer in Australia, which was the summer of 2019-2020, where bushfires started in what is officially called winter and ran through to the following autumn. So it was about a 9-month period during which fires were burning at emergency level at some point somewhere all along the coast. And so this image is taken from Mallacoota, which is on the border between Victoria and New South Wales. I don't expect people to know where that is, but it's quite remote. And this was on New Year's Eve 2019, and the fire front came so quickly to that town that people didn't have time to leave. They're surrounded by forest either way, and only one road up north and one road south, and there was no way to get out. So they ended up with about 4,000 people plus animals like horses evacuated to the beach, and with kids trying to get people in boats and like taking them out to sea, which is something similar that we've seen in other islands that have had bushfires, or I think you call them wildfires recently, such as in Greece, and I think also in Hawaii as well, that the coast becomes this place of evacuation. So what I thought I'd do is actually talk through some other people's writing around that time. And so this is from a small opinion piece that my colleague Killian Quigley wrote, again in reference to Mallacoota. So Killian is a, I guess, like blue humanities scholar. So he's referencing Geoffrey Dutton, who I don't know, but Geoffrey Dutton wrote that for white settler Australians, the beach was the nearest available thing to sacred sites or temples. But the events of these past weeks have passed that myth and all it means through a fiery and transforming mirror and given us its warped, hellish negative at Mallacoota Wharf. This is the coast as site, not of freedom, but of last resort. This nation has a shoreside story at its core, one that has been predicated from the first on violence, expropriation, and the mythologies of terra and aqua nullius. On the beach in Malakuta, the Lucky Country's narrative arc was arrested and pinned face down in the sand between bushfire and saltwater. The next three are excerpts from a blog that I started with my friend Mandy during that summer that we called Fire Fields. And it was an invitation for people to write an open letter to their Member of Parliament about how they felt about the summer. And it started from Mandy, who was one of my prior students, actually, who'd said, I've written this stuff and I don't know what to do with it, but I'm sending it to you, I guess, because we had that established relationship of teacher and student where teacher reads someone's writing. So Mandy sent me this letter, and eventually we decided to make it into a blog, and then invited others to contribute as well. And so this is part of Mandy's reflection. A dear friend asked me last week if my relationship with summer had changed, given the devastation and horror that this summer, and in fact spring, had so far wrought. I answered without really thinking that no, I still loved summer. The feeling of sunshine and warm breeze on my skin, the scent of freshly cut grass, birds waking me at dawn, and the cacophony of cicadas at dusk, swimming in the ocean, exploring nature, lying under a tree, gazing up at the blue, blue sky. Freedom, summer, my happy place. But the season we're experiencing now is nothing like summers past. The blue sky has been replaced by mammoth clouds of smoke and ash, blocking the sun's rays. The ocean is scattered with the same ash and burnt, blackened leaves. Dead birds, feathers also blackened, wash up on the shore. Exploring nature is mostly out of the question, as great swathes of the landscape have been annihilated or cut off, and the simple act of breathing is hazardous. The green aroma of cut grass has been replaced by the smell of unimaginable things burning, acrid and choking. The next one is from a colleague, Lisa. The scenes from the bushfires have brought out fear and grief that I'd been hoping never to experience, and fighting for others not to experience for so many years. I attended a climate grief workshop to help me start to address these feelings, during which I drew two pictures. One is the scene I just can't get out of my head of standing on a fairly isolated beach in Broken Bay with my 2-year-old son as the sky was golden orange and ash flakes snowed down upon us. There were children in the water who were laughing and playing, trying to catch the ashes with the goal of catching the biggest one possible. Did they know what it was? It was a very apocalyptic scene. It was very hard to accept that it was really happening, and we were not even in the worst of the fire zones. And the final one is from a woman called Corinna, who contributed this from on the south coast, so somewhere between Sydney and Malakuta that I mentioned previously. Recently, we met with a group of friends, the usual crowd from school and sport, only this time things were very different. One had received a life-saving phone call while defending her home, imploring her to seek shelter. Having retreated to the pool where she had previously stowed her scuba gear, she spent anxious minutes underwater while the fire passed over her property, emerging to find the house intact. I feel an obligation to keep people's stories alive because I'm scared that communities pulling together in the wake of natural disasters is no longer enough, either in a practical sense or as a defining narrative. And then just to wrap up, I'm going to share some words from my colleague Danielle Salameyer. This is from an opinion piece written in The Guardian just about a month ago, so nearly, I guess, 3.5 to 4 years after that summer. And she talks about what she's calling summer dread. So I guess for contextual information, between that summer and now, we've had 3 years of summers that were really quite wet and cool because of La Nina. And now we have El Nino returning again. I'm not sure if those meteorological terms mean much to people wherever you are, but it's a climatic phenomenon that greatly affects our weather in Australia. So Danny writes, born by news of soaring temperatures and wildfires in the Northern Hemisphere, the arrival of El Nino and the feeling of hardening earth under my feet, summer dread is returning to my body. The early mornings I used to spend strolling the donkeys over to their daytime pasture are now committed to lead training so that all of us become comfortable with emergency evacuation procedures. It's galling for them and a chore for me, but also shadowed by some of my grimmest memories, frantically manhandling them onto a truck at 44 odd degrees on the 28th of December, 2019, the fire baying on the other side of the Shoalhaven River. 4 years on from the Black Summer fires, anticipating what climate change will mean for the Australian summer feels very different. I know I'm not the only one feeling this toxic mix of emotions, a tremor through my body when another climate-related news item flashes across the screen, the drop in my stomach when I look at the weather app and every single day is marked with a sun icon, my throat tightening when I see a graph displaying another sharply descending line. So I guess they're all fairly grim reflections, but I think given that, white settler people in Australia, not all of us, but a lot of us occupy positions of a lot of privilege, and also in a country that leads the world in fossil fuel exports and in the cultural mythology of fossil fuels being correlated with the good life, that we have a lot of cultural power to shape, how the world understands and responds to climate change, for better or for worse. And I think that it's hard to see sometimes here, like business as usual just continues. And one of the things that shocked me during that summer was like people just keep going to work. It's like the air is unbreathable for months at a time, but people put the suits on and they trundle into the office and tap away at the keyboards or whatever they're doing. But I think that looking at the ways that these mythologies around, nature are being challenged, even within quite privileged positions, can hopefully offer us an avenue to how we intervene in the dominant imaginaries of environmentalism and of capitalism, I guess. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Blanche. That was wonderful. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to, on behalf of our audience, give you a round of silent applause or snaps. And I'm also going to invite anyone in the audience to begin putting their questions in the Q&A. And while I wait for that to populate for a minute, I'm going to ask the first question, which really has to do with language. One of the things that I notice about each of our panelists is that they are pushing against the limits of language and its poetic and expressive qualities, to talk about the affective dimensions of crisis. And so I want to maybe ask each of you to reflect a little bit on the ways that you use language. So I'm thinking of Roque's book of poetry, in which the use of the footnote ultimately expresses in Spanish, a very powerful sentiment that sometimes is at odds with the text that's above the footnote. So there's a sort of violence being done to the idea of the footnote. I see, Blanche writes about the notion that climate is feeling, and sort of changing the ideas of what climate actually is. You talk about settler atmospherics in your book for a bit, and I hope you guys might talk about that. Malcolm coined the phrase world ship, going against, in some ways, what the known world was considered to be, and what the idea of what a ship actually does. So I'm hoping that maybe we could have a conversation about language, what its uses are in the face of these overlapping crises, and what it means to even do some violence to language. I also think of Roque like pushing back against this concept of the natural, right? And what does that mean? So I'll just open up the floor, and then I will take some of the many questions from the Q&A, and I'll read those aloud to you. So thank you.
you want to go first, Roque? You don't have to. Does anyone want to?
Sure. It's hard for me because I almost always am thinking about language, so I feel like everything I say sort of ends up becoming like this very long unending paragraph if I begin anywhere. But yeah, I can definitely respond to the use of my footnotes. I wanted it to sort of be something that people projected a great deal onto. And I do believe that this particular book invites a lot of reader participation and response. So sort of the space between English and Spanish, right? The non-translatability or the refusal to translate definitely mirrors my refusal to explain or answer certain questions after Maria, right? Sort of like the sudden discovery of our existence, we would say, descubrieron America, they discovered the Americas, right? In the US was a little overwhelming, in the sense that everybody wanted to talk to me about Puerto Rico, but only and exclusively in relation to like suffering, right? The suffering of sort of like, I would say a racialized distinction between body and mind, right? Where like, then like the global south is producing a kind of images of suffering bodies, but not any kind of like voice or intellectual production of any kind. And so, you know, I just really didn't want to talk about it because I was so traumatized, and then everybody wanted to talk to me about it. So in a way, that silence is, and that sort of mirrors that sort of refusal. It also literally was what happened. I mean, most people in Puerto Rico, they didn't really have access to news. You know, cell phone signals were down. It was very limited. The cell phone towers weren't working. They had to charge their phones and like Burger King or whatever, you know, in order to like get a phone call. Even just communicating with my own family back home was like that. So the experience for the diaspora was that we were flooded with images, and the experience of Puerto Rico was that people were living in a very isolated sort of microcosmic space of their barrio or their neighborhood or their street, but didn't really know what was happening on the other side of the island. And you know, it also, I think, was a physical distance, you know, thinking of things like the Jones Act, you know, the limitations of ships that could come into ports to US ships, you know, made it so that humanitarian aid couldn't come from elsewhere except for the suspension of about 7 days. And so the ocean became this expanse that I tried to hold sort of as that blank space between the body, quote unquote, body of the text and the footnote. I think I answered that question.
So I'll go with the order. Language is everything, so I kind of I don't know. I mean, different types of language, of course. And I guess there's also a language of violence that is in all of these climate disasters, or even climate change itself. And there are different speeds to violence. And one thing I wanted to say was looking at the quote unquote slow racist violence, not of only the impact, the moments of the events, but looking at the build-up. Of course, you have the injustices, the social discrimination, the racist discrimination. But because we are in a university atmosphere, it happens in universities as well. So what I described as being in spaces that are more white than the rest of societies, it happens at university. It happens to me today. And so there is also a type of emotional work, but as a researcher, as a scholar, you have to do to be in these spaces where you say, okay, there's a problem, but then everyone looks at you saying you are the problem. And to try to, and then you are still being taught to have a certain language to speak with or to certain people, but then you go back to your barrio, you go back to your island, and you say, okay, how can I also be responsible be responsible for my words to my people? And it's a challenge. It's a different type of a challenge, and I think, for example, in my book, many of the actually conceptual work was created with pieces of music, poem, novels, and even singers that song in Creole. So that's for example, nowadays the term, the concept that is still in vogue is the concept of the Anthropocene. I think it's a flawed concept for many reasons, and there's been a critique for like almost 10 years now about this concept. But I suggest another one in my book as my contribution to the debate. I talk about the Negrocene. But the way I formulate this, it comes from a song first, from a Martinican singer first, someone who plays the flute and who does the equivalent of La Bomba in Puerto Rico. It's called Belé in Martinique. And it was not just a way to illustrate, it was really the way I think. I think with music, I think with art, and I write. And so, yeah, that was the way I could get away from a language, because the issue is not just that it's not whiteness. I mean, the issue is not that a group of, let's say, privileged white people would do the right or the wrong thing. The issue is that they have the power. So we need to remove the power. I mean, that's that, like, redistribute social rights, dignity rights. But yeah, so and language is at the heart of even both the writing but also the conceptual work. Yeah.
Thank you. Great question, Charlotte. So I did maths and science at school in my undergrad. So I don't really have any training in thinking critically about language, but I've come to find it very interesting. But I came to this work around emotions through my teaching practice, teaching undergrad students around climate change. And I guess what I was trying to do in my book specifically was to kind of make the book a pedagogical experimentation, so that it wasn't just, you know, in good teaching practice, we try not to just talk at our students, but to get them engaged and actively participating in the conversation. But obviously a book is a, you know, monological way of like, I'm the author and these are my words and you read it. And we kind of expect that to be a somewhat passive, like people just consume the information. So I wanted it to kind of perform what I was talking about as a pedagogy. So for that reason, I was trying to tell a story and present language in a way and structure parts of the book that performed what I was calling the affective atmosphere of our classroom, of one that was really confused and anxious and overwhelmed, but yet staying with it collectively. And so in the intro to my book, I think there's one point where I just speak directly to the reader and say, you know, I'd love if you can become aware of how you're feeling as you read this, and to what extent, you know, the place that you're in, the person you are, contributes to what that experience is and how it differentiates according to the time and place and your positionality. And then, yeah, there's sort of 3 chapters that open with vignettes that I've presented as a first-person narrative, but are composed through quotes from all different students to try to perform this kind of semi-collective identity that was kind of emerging in our class around shared experiences. And yeah, I guess I just really wanted the reader to have an experience of what it feels like to listen to people talk about how scared they are about planetary crisis, and to witness that. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, that was wonderful. And I really felt that also, Blanche, in your talk when you mentioned like the diary as a form, sort of the blog or diary as a form of recording climate. And I see it too in Roque's, the idea of taking on an epic poem is so amazing. It really blew my mind listening to you talk about this sort of center, this labyrinth at whose center is a Walgreens, which is, funny because it's so ridiculous and really points up, the sort of settler colonial like epicenter of Puerto Rican realities right now too. Malcolm, I'm also thinking about the really interesting work you've done on chlordacone, toxic pollution from like fumigations of banana plantations in Martinique, which brings up questions of not just slow violence, but questions of scale in terms of time and in terms of toxicity. So I think that they're sort of pushing against the language of disaster there too. But instead of just saying what I think, I'm going to read one of the questions from a student. I'm hoping we'll have time for at least maybe 2 more questions. So for those of you putting questions in the chat, keep at it. But I'm going to put the question in the chat so everyone can see it. It was directed to Blanche, but I'm going to make it sort of broader for everyone, right? So you talk about in your book the idea of climactic phenomenon as affective. You explain that the climate is a living phenomenon that emerges from the interactions and relationships between all bodies, right? Human, non-human, inanimate, living, dead, ancient, and yet to come. So what are the main research and ethical challenges that this proposal imposes in the field of environmental humanities? And here I'm almost thinking of like, what kind of epistemic shift do we need that might come, that I think each of you has addressed in your work in some ways. So what are this idea of all bodies, living, dead, ancient, yet to come, human, non-human, how do we, if we want to take a disaster as an opportunity, not just for disaster capitalists, but as for, world-changing possibilities, right? How do we approach that in terms of the way that we think through what's happening, as opposed to just responding, right?
Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. That's a great question. Thank you for the close reading. I think for me, I guess, because I'm thinking about climate change all the time, so you might be able to say this about any phenomenon, but for me, I think it's useful to think of climate not as a thing, but as the outcome of the relationships between everything. And when we start to think like that, instead of thinking of the climate as something that's out there and separate from us, we see that climate is produced in everything that everyone does all the time. And I think it can help us push back against the doomism that says that like, oh, the fossil fuel companies, they're going to keep doing their thing and there's nothing we can do to change it, by focusing on the fact that everyone has agency in what climate becomes. That doesn't mean that the hierarchies aren't grossly unequal, but it also means that this isn't the first time that we've participated in what climate becomes. It helps us contest that idea of the Anthropocene as well, by showing that maybe we didn't know it in the same way we know it now, but humans have always been creating and changing climates. And for the vast majority of human history, we did that in ways that were sustainable and viable and rich and, created flourishing, and that this is a brief aberration in that history, and there's no reason that the current cultural practices of capitalism are inherent or unavoidable or inevitable. But I think the other kind of way to think about it is that, like, from here on, now that we have that knowledge, we're always going to be involved in climate governance, as contested and messy as that is. We're not going to fix climate change and then tick that off and never think about it again. There's always going to be conversations around, like what average temperature are we going to settle on, like really big complex stuff like that, and who gets a voice and a say in it, and those sorts of things. Anyway, I'll pause because I think we're already over time.
We can go for a few more minutes, but thank you for giving the other panelists a chance to talk and to answer, that kind of big world shifting way of looking at things. Thanks.
So maybe if we go the other direction, I'll go. A quick answer. How does this challenge? What challenges it impose on the field of environmental humanities? Maybe the name environmental humanities is no longer the right one. Just because what is the environment? Because that's always the question. It's never clear to me. Maybe I can. I don't know if I can, Charlotte, but I can use this time to address some of the Q&A that was asked, and I think someone asked if my research includes other islands like the one of Cuba in the Caribbean, and
sure, yes.
But the subtitle is Thinking from the Caribbean World, which is not necessarily thinking from the Caribbean as a defined geographical space with its borders. The Caribbean world is infinite and can be experienced in different places, including in New York, including in Paris, including in Australia, and so I never claimed to have a exhaustivity, to be exhaustive in the analysis of each context. There are many researchers that can do that, but it's really thinking about what the Caribbean meant for the history of modernity and the history of globalization as a starting point. And I wanted to mention this because Adrienne Galli asked a question regarding the reliance on the former colonizers. And that last week, at the end of last week, there was this major earthquake in Morocco, which, thousands of people killed or injured. But something very interesting happened. France, with its, high heels and, Superman kind of colonial power, say, oh, we're going to send help for N30. And the Moroccan people refused. They said, no, we don't want your help. We'll take other people's help, but not your help. But I just wanted to share that with you. Still recognizing that basically humanitarian approach are always unequal and colonial in its essence. It implies thinking of the other one as someone who doesn't have agency, or doesn't have, is not an equal partner in participating in the world. So it's obviously there are collaborative and kind of horizontal approaches, but it's a struggle because you still have a system that would be predicated upon just a number. How many people you say you quote unquote saved? I don't want to be saved by you. But then it's difficult to say this when you don't have water, like you don't have electricity, like Roque was saying. So it's a struggle, like to what no, not everyone can have that position that Morocco took at this point. Yeah. Right.
Thank you very much. I think that's very true. I want to pass the la palabra to Roque too, because I have a feeling he's thinking about similar things. in Puerto Rico also. Yeah.
Pues mira, the problem after Maria was the problem before Maria, which was the United States having ultimate say in what happens in Puerto Rico. And the structures that come out of that very long relationship, and the structures that came before from the other colonial relationship under Spain that preceded the structures that have left dependencies created, right? It's not, sometimes so much is placed in this notion of the individual being able to, as an individual, right, say no or yes, and it's just so much more complicated. I think an example can be power and electricity, right? Under the constantly defunded government entity, La Autoridad de Energía Eléctrica, which was the company existed when Maria happened, that was defunded over years because there was a refusal to tax the wealthy because of also local colonial government in collaboration with, a US imperialism. And then when Maria comes, the response is also ultimately not in the hands of the workers that work for Energía Eléctrica. It's also in the hands of the government where it puts those resources. And so there's the Jones Act didn't permit for ships to come in that weren't US ships. Of course, we can think of aid versus solidarity. We can have conversations about that, but when there's a law that says that the only ships that can come in are coming from your colonizer, it really does limit things, right? It even limits the conversation you can have around that, because then it becomes very abstract in relation to something very concrete. And that was suspended for about 7 days, but it takes about a week for a ship to arrive, so it didn't make any sense, the suspension. And then after that, right, the Fiscal Control Board, which was established before Maria under Promesa, the I'm not even going to say local government, Puerto Rican government was, voted against the imposition of LUMA, which is the power company we have now. But then, of course, the junta said we're going to impose it anyways. You have to. And how to think about things from an academic point of view. Well, electricity goes out of my house minimum 3 times a week, and I'm like middle class, like electricity goes out of my house sometimes 24 hours, and everyone hates LUMA, and everyone's without light, and there are protests, and there were many protests, and they renewed the contract, right? Because it's not about serving people's needs, it's about getting whoever their friends are to have that. And this on top of compounded, right? Like the compounded crises that are not exclusive to Puerto Rico. I think for me, the emblematic moment is we had the earthquakes that came in early 2020 before the pandemic, right? Which devastated the South, but it impacted everyone. And so there were all these measures that, how you were supposed to have a backpack and it was supposed to have these things. So when there was an earthquake, you could run out the door. And then at some point we were receiving 2 messages. One is, don't go outside because you're going to die because of the pandemic. And the other was, you got to run out if there's an earthquake. So you were like, what do I do? Do I run out with the pandemic when there's an earth? Do I stay inside? Right? And what if then at some point there was like, maybe there's a hurricane coming. So, right. I laugh because I think it's just how that affects, I would say, would be my affective response. Our affective response is anger, is everything. And if you add to that, right, there's so little mental health support. There's no kind of like crisis management post Maria. People turn to art, but art isn't therapy, right? So it's all of the things, and it's not exclusive to Puerto Rico. And I would say that, it really resonated with me when Blanche was like, people just go to work like it's like nothing's happening. And I feel that happens a lot in academia, right? I feel like the conversations are still happening, like things haven't changed in the last 5 years radically, right? like, what, we're still having these conversations like nothing. And I think that for me is shocking always. Because I'm like, it feels like the world is ending every day. Do you not feel that urgency? Do you not feel that all the time? And sometimes you look in an academic article and you would think none of that was happening. And I think that dissonance for me is something that is forever unaddressed.
Wow, those are really powerful words from Roque, also from Malcolm, ready for the revolution and the redistribution of power, which I love. And I think we're going to wrap up now, but I just wanted to leave all of us with this sort of shared thread that runs through what we're talking about here, which is the abandonment of our state, our institutions, including our universities, in that sort of human right of shelter and of the basics of water, light, and what we need to survive. And it's really sort of been thrust onto the individual in a deeply unjust way, asking individuals to be ready for their own hurricane response, or to cope on their own with no mental health resources. So I hope that this conversation has given us some larger ideas to think through how to change the whole world, but also especially the university to be the kind of places that are open to everyone that we want to inhabit, and which we can elevate your voices. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with you here today. I hope we have longer conversations later in person in Sydney, Paris, and Puerto Rico. That would be great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and take care. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.